Okay. So we had a terrific start today in our session with the wonderful welcome from the Djanira Institute and Daniela, and the very beautiful framing that we had from Joel Carpenter, and then Paul Freston's really insightful address. So we have a lot that we're going to continue to work within today in terms of developing this vision of how we might understand Brazil, Brazilian evangelicals, American evangelicals, and then a broader vision as we get into the evening session. Just to kind of get us alert and a little entertained, we're going to watch a video from our dear friend Alexandre, who is going to take us back to childhood. Alexandre, the video.
Okay, one minute.
This is the moment that's now required of every webinar when you try to fix the technology. It has to happen. The new normal. Henrique, rapaz. Beijão.
Para exercitar sua paciência.
Where is your mustache?
Ah, sua barba, rapaz. If you're looking at my wall and you're wondering if that is Pancho Villa behind me on the wall, that is in fact Pancho Villa. Just to make things clear where we are here.
Okay. Song. Sorry, 1 minute again.
Group leaders of the pandemic. Glad we could all make it, especially gentlemen. The pandemic. Glad we could all make it, especially you, Jair. As you know, this is a safe space to share our feelings, fears, and our thoughts. Wait, what is an email? Please, real question is, what is an opponent? I love your stuff. Okay, let's go. I was a great person, woman, man, camera. Hey! What a yeah. Hello, gentlemen. Welcome to this week's meeting of the Corona Case. Especially you. And our wait, guys, what is an He's an opponent. I know it's tough. Okay, let's go. I will start. I'm doing great. Person, woman, man, camera, TV. Hey! What a big. Got it. Very proud of me. How about you?
I am sure. Just secured the right to be president of Russia for life.
On life? How do you do that? I want to do that. I'm pro-life and I want to be president of life.
No. First, you have to run country for 30 years. Then you get to be president for life.
From 2040, with your help, we will get there together. Now, how are you doing? No, it is just a little flu. Nothing to see down here in Brazil. No. Amazon rainforest. Problem. Very strong. Okay. The latest coronavirus case. Drum roll, please. In third place this week. Vladimir. Yeah, but Russia is a great power. This is outright. All right. It's are the real virus, so he's been a little distracted. And now in second place, cases again, Brazil. Burn 100 acres of Amazon rainforest just to celebrate. Do it. Yes. Okay, and now the top spot for China virus infections, I call it the China virus. The top spot I have once again this week. But America.
Okay. If you're not sure whether that was the real people or those were puppets, you feel just exactly the way I do. But clearly, it's not just comedians who are having quite a good time of it. There's all kinds of different ways that we're trying to grasp what's happening in the world in this, what feels like a new moment of global history itself. And to continue to deepen our understanding of that, we're going to be joined today by John Fia at the beginning, who's going to be talking to us about the American evangelical support of Donald Trump and give us some historical framework for that. John Fia is the Distinguished Professor of American History at Messiah University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. He is a recognized expert on the historical influence of evangelicalism in American culture and an award-winning author. In 2011, Fia published the book, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation?, which won the Forward Review's Book of the Year Award in Religion and was named a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. Fia received the New Jersey Academic Alliance Book of the Year Award for his first book, The Way of Improvement Leads Home, a study of the state of New Jersey in the time of the American Revolution. Fia co-edited the book Confessing History, Explorations in Christian Faith and the Historian's Vocation, published in 2010. He's also written the book Why Study History, reflecting on the importance of the past, and The Bible Cause, a history of the American Bible Society. Today's talk is based on research from his most recent book, Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, published in 2018 with Erdman's. In addition to his books, Dr. Fia has regularly published articles in academic periodicals and popular news outlets, including the Journal of American History, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, Sojourners, Al Jazeera, America, and USA Today. He routinely speaks at churches and historical organizations across the country, as well as universities big and small, and you can sometimes catch him on CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, among others. More personally, John Fia is my oldest friend in the profession. We attended seminary together in Chicago back in the early 1990s, and it gives me enormous delight to introduce him to you. So let's welcome Dr. John Fia.
Thank you, Eric. Can everybody hear and see me? Maybe Eric, can you give me a thumb? Can you let me know?
Yep, sounds good.
You see me? You can
Yep.
see me too. Well, thank you for Eric for that introduction. As Eric said, we go way back with almost 30 years now. I think I've known Eric and have been a close friend with him, a travel companion along the way of my work as a historian. There are very few things that I do or write or think about that I don't bounce off of Eric. So it's an honor to be part of this collaboration here, especially with Eric, some of Eric's new work with Brazilian evangelicalism. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that we can have. What I wanted to do today in the time that I have with you is to talk about at least one of the dimensions behind white evangelical support for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election, and then again in, I think, what we're going to see in the 2020 election in November. And again, I'd be happy during the question and answer session to answer any questions related to that. But what I really want to focus on in the book that I wrote, Believe Me, that Eric mentioned, I suggested that there were three white evangelical Christians in the United States voted for Donald Trump. One was a long-standing pursuit of political power that white evangelicals have really sought out since they have been slightly marginalized in light of a more diverse, in the wake of a more diverse culture that began in the 80s and 90s. So the pursuit of power, and I tried to juxtapose that pursuit of power with the kind of politics of humility, I think, that kind of maybe comes from the teachings of Jesus. And then the other thing I think that's important here is nostalgia. White American evangelicals tend to long for a golden age in which, evangelical Christians held cultural power in the United States. And for a variety of reasons, white evangelicals no longer hold the cultural power that they once had in the 19th and early parts of the 20th century. So whenever there is this kind of loss of cultural power, people tend to become nostalgic for a past that in some cases never maybe even existed in the first place. But what I want to focus on in my talk today is the third. So we have power, pursuit of power, a longing, a nostalgic longing for a golden age. But today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of fear and what role fear has played in the evangelical support for Donald Trump. I want to start out by reading for you a description of a 2020 Trump campaign ad from Vanity Fair magazine. This description is by journalist Eric Lutz, and it appeared in the July 2020 issue of Vanity Fair, an article about Trump and his campaign. So it starts this way, quote, "An elderly woman sits on the couch in her darkened living room. She is watching Fox News, where Sean Hannity is taking Joe Biden to task for seeking to defund the police departments, a position that the Democratic nominee has not actually adopted, much to the chagrin of some in his party's progressive wing. As she shakes her head at the television, a masked man creeps around her house and attempts to jimmy open her door with a crowbar. She tries to call the police, but to no avail. The phone rings in an empty station. 'Hello, you've reached 911, says a voice on the answering machine. I'm sorry, there is no one here to answer your emergency call, but leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. The intruder finally breaks in and comes after the woman, who drops the phone in horror. You won't be safe, the tagline reads, in Joe Biden's America. Earlier this month, while speaking to reporters, this was just a couple of weeks ago actually, but speaking to reporters on an airport tarmac in Cleveland, Ohio, Donald Trump said that if Joe Biden were elected president, quote, you will have a disruption in the markets the likes of which our country has never seen. You will have a crash in the markets because he is going to double and triple your taxes. He's going to do things that nobody would ever think even possible because he's following the radical left agenda. Take away your guns, destroy your Second Amendment, no religion, no anything, hurt the Bible, hurt God. He's against God and he's against guns, unquote. Now, if you haven't figured this out by this point, these are appeals to an anxious people. Trump's appeal to fear, especially white evangelical fear about the collapse of a Christian nation, explains perhaps more than any other factor why evangelicals voted in such large numbers for Trump in 2016 and continue to support his presidency as we approach the November 2020 election. The American Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson once wrote, quote, fear is not a Christian habit of mind, unquote. And the great poet of the Jersey Shore, Bruce Springsteen, sings, quote, fear's a dangerous thing. It can turn your heart black, you can trust. It'll take your God-filled soul and fill it with devils and dust, unquote. Robinson and Springsteen echo verses in nearly every book of the Bible, the sacred text that serves as the source of spiritual authority in evangelical life. Moses told the Israelites to, quote, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today, unquote. The Hebrew God told Job, quote, at the destruction and famine you shall laugh, and shall not fear the beasts of the earth. The psalmist wrote, quote, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me, unquote. The Gospel of John teaches Christians that there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. And St. Luke writes, fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Despite all these scriptural passages, it is still possible, I would argue, to write an entire history of American evangelicalism as the story of a people failing miserably at overcoming fear with hope, trust, and faith in their God. But it is also possible to find evangelicals drawing deeply, for example, from Christian theological resources, who sought to forge an alternative history. So what would a history of evangelical fear look like? And how might an alternative history of evangelicalism counter that history of evangelical fear? Because I think you can find both in the historical record. A history of evangelical fear in the United States or in America might begin with the 17th century Puritans in Salem, Massachusetts, who feared that there were witches in their midst, threatening their city upon a hill and their status as God's new Israel. They responded to this fear by hanging 19 people. But other evangelical options were certainly available. As Puritans began to lose control over Massachusetts Bay, they might have turned to their sovereign God for guidance and trusted in his protection to lead them through a new phase in the history of the colony. Or they could have heeded the warnings put forth by those people such as Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, or the growing number of Baptists in the colony, who saw the potential problems with such a close relationship between church and state. Our history of evangelical fear might also include a chapter on the early 19th century Protestants who feared the arrival of massive numbers of Catholic immigrants to American shores. They translated their panic into political organizations, such as the nativist Know Nothing Party or the American Party, and religious tracts cautioning fellow believers of the threat that such popery posed to their Christian nation, largely Protestant nation as they understood it. But other evangelical options, again, were available. Biblical faith requires evangelicals to welcome strangers in their midst as a sign of Christian hospitality. While some of the most prominent evangelicals of the era, such as Charles Finney and Lyman Beecher, were spewing anti-Catholic rhetoric, other evangelicals could not reconcile such hatred with Christian love. These evangelicals, as historian Richard Cowardine has written, could be found in all evangelical denominations in the 1840s and 1850s. The history of evangelical fear might also note that Catholics made up just one front in the battle for a Protestant America. Infidels, as they were called, made up the other front. At the turn of the 19th century, evangelicals went to war against unbelievers, deists, skeptics, free thinkers, and other assorted heretics who threatened the godly character of the Republic. Elias Boudinot, a former president of the United States Continental Congress, agonized that unless he and his team of evangelical federalists curbed the influence of the followers of Thomas Paine, the United States would end up like the Church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation. Quote, "Because you are lukewarm in your faith, I am about to spit you out of my mouth," unquote. Jedediah Morse, a Massachusetts minister and the author of geography textbooks, worried that the Bavarian Illuminati, a German anti-Christian secret society, had infiltrated America to, quote, "abjure Christianity, justify suicide, advocate sensual pleasures agreeable to Epicurean philosophy, decry marriage, and advocate a promiscuous intercourse among the sexes," unquote. When godless Thomas Jefferson was elected president of the United States in 1800, frightened New England evangelicals thought the Virginians' henchmen would soon be arriving in their towns and homes on a mission to confiscate their Bibles. But other evangelical options were also available. While Federalists like Boudinot and Morse railed against Jefferson and his followers, stoking fear at every turn, Baptists and Methodists flocked to Jefferson in droves. They understood that Jefferson's defense of religious freedom would allow evangelical faith to flourish in America. And they were right. When religion in America was separated from state sponsorship, it resulted in a massive religious revival, which historians have described as the Second Great Awakening. In the antebellum South, evangelicals, according to some historians, made up close to 80% of the region's population. Southern evangelicals were caught up in a slave system that kept them in constant fear for their lives and the lives of their families. Slave rebellions against their white masters were relatively scarce, but when insurrections did take place, they brought paranoia and panic. One South Carolina widow claimed to lie in bed each night, fearing that at any moment one of her slaves would break into her house and hack her to death with an axe. The aggressive moral rhetoric and publishing campaigns of Northern opponents of slavery threatened the white Southern evangelical way of life and prompted fears of a race war. In response, some of the South's best evangelical minds went to work constructing a complex biblical and theological defense of slavery. But other evangelical options were available. Modern day attempts by Southern evangelicals, especially those in the Southern Baptist Convention, to come to terms with its slaveholding and racist past imply that the Northern abolitionists, the thousands of evangelicals who came to the South during Reconstruction, and those who fought for racial equality during Jim Crow, were on the religious high ground. They represented a much more consistent evangelical ethic on this moral problem. This very short history of evangelical fear would certainly need to spend some time in the decades following the Civil War, as evangelicals waged intellectual and religious battles against Darwinism and the higher criticism of the Bible. Some of the worst aspects of American evangelicalism converged in the fundamentalist movement of the early 20th century. It was stridently anti-Catholic, and on occasion worked closely with the Ku Klux Klan to guard the white Protestant Catholics. Fundamentalists, committed to the otherworldly teachings of the holiness or higher life movement, chose to separate from the world rather than engage it. They promoted a theology of the end times, otherwise known as dispensationalism, that led them to spend considerable energy trying to identify the appearance of the Antichrist on the global stage. In defending the so-called fundamentals of the faith, these anti-modernists relied on authoritarian clergymen. These fear-mongers gained followers, built large congregations, and established national reputations by sounding the alarm of the modernist threat whenever they saw it rearing its ugly head. They took on the role of ecclesiastical strongmen, protecting their congregations from outsiders who threatened to destroy their faith and the Christian identity of the nation. But once more, other evangelical options were available. Those concerned about doctrinal drift could have learned something from the biblical virtues of love and humility. The sense of certainty that defined the fundamentalist movement in America might have been replaced with a sense of mystery and the embrace of a God who could not always be confined to man-made doctrinal formulations and end-of-the-world speculations. Perhaps such an approach might have tempered the militancy of the movement and provided fundamentalism with a more respected public platform in the decades following the 1925 Scopes trial. Since World War II, evangelical anxiety has intensified. In 1947, in the landmark case Everson versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court announced a wall of separation between church and state, and they described that wall as high and impregnable. The court drew on this decision when it banned prayer and mandatory Bible reading in public schools in 1962 and 1963, respectively. The demographic makeup of the country was also changing. The Hart-Celler Act of 1965 opened American shores to millions of Africans, Asians, and Middle Easterners. Many of these new immigrants brought their non-Christian religious beliefs and practices with them, creating unprecedented religious diversity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Supreme Court efforts at desegregating Christian academies and colleges led to fierce resistance from Southern evangelicals, who saw the federal government as taking away their local autonomy and the religious freedom to control their own admissions policies. By the way, these arguments were not unlike those put forth by the Southern states that seceded from the Union in 1860 and 1861. By the late 1960s, the feminist movement was posing a threat to the long-held conservative evangelical commitment to patriarchal households. And in 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion in Roe v. Wade. For those who saw all these things contributing to the decline of a Christian culture in the United States, there was obviously much to fear. Any effort then to make sense of the 81% of evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump cannot ignore evangelicals' fear of the Barack Obama administration. Obama was an exotic figure to many white conservative evangelicals. He grew up in Hawaii, and he spent time as a child in a predominantly Muslim country. He was the son of a white woman and an African man. He had a strange name, and the fact that his middle name was Hussein did not help. Obama had a Christian conversion story, but it was not the kind of Christian conversion story from which many white conservative evangelicals would find inspiration. His embrace of Christianity took place in a liberal African-American congregation in Chicago under the guidance of a pastor, Jeremiah Wright, who was not shy about calling America to task for its past sins of slavery and racism. Obama's social policies alienated conservative evangelicals. Though pro-life could be used to describe his views on immigration, healthcare, the death penalty, the fight against poverty, and civil rights for racial and ethnic minorities, Obama was pro-choice on abortion. And for most evangelicals in the United States, that was all that really mattered. And then there was gay marriage. When Obama ran for president in 2008, he supported same-sex unions, but defended marriage as a union between a man and a woman. During his first 2 years in office, he supported the Defense of Marriage Act, a law that prohibited married same-sex couples from collecting federal benefits. But in February 2011, he changed his position on the act and instructed Attorney General Eric Holder to stop defending it in court. In a May 2012 interview with ABC News, Obama announced that he had gone through an evolution on the issue. He was now willing to affirm, quote, that same-sex couples should be able to get married, unquote. In 2013, the Supreme Court in United States versus Windsor declared the Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional, and the Obama administration began extending federal rights and benefits to same-sex couples, married couples. By 2015, when the court ruled in Obergefell versus Hodges that the United States government would recognize same-sex marriages, the practice was already legal in 36 states and Washington, D.C. On the evening after the Obergefell decision, Obama showed his appreciation by illuminating the White House in rainbow colors. The LGBT community saw the Obergefell decision as the culmination of a long struggle for civil rights. Conservative evangelicals, on the other hand, cringed. For them, it all happened too fast. In the hours after the decision, they turned to their blogs, their websites, their media outlets, and they wrote apocalyptic opinion pieces on how to cope in a post-Christian society. And what history of evangelical fear would be complete without a chapter on Hillary Clinton? After a recent lecture on Trump and his evangelical supporters, a woman approached me at the lectern and identified herself as an evangelical who voted for Trump. I am part of the 81%, she said. But what choice did I have? I have heard something similar many, many times from evangelicals who voted for Trump. Evangelicals are not supposed to hate, but many hate Hillary Clinton. The history of that antipathy is long, reaching back at least to Bill Clinton's first presidential campaign in 1992. But it was solidified among white evangelical baby boomers when revelations of her husband's marital infidelities surfaced in 1998. Conservatives who challenged Bill Clinton's character were outraged when Hillary attacked her husband's accusers and went on the Today Show and claimed that the impeachment charges against her husband were part of a quote unquote vast right-wing conspiracy. Hillary Clinton did not help herself among evangelicals in the 2016 election campaign. She lied about using a private email server in her role as Secretary of State. She placed Trump supporters in a basket of deplorables. She made no effort to court evangelical votes, and this is a strategy that the progressive evangelical writer and Clinton supporter sounding and incredibly stupid. On the policy front, Clinton was, for most white evangelicals, an extension of the Obama presidency, a candidate who would steamroll their long-cherished conservative values. Faced with a choice between Clinton and a race-baiting, xenophobic, lying adulterer who promised to support conservative Supreme Court justices, white conservative evangelicals in the United States chose the latter. In 2016, American evangelicals were looking for a strong man to protect them from the progressive forces wreaking havoc on their Christian nation. Donald Trump was that strong man. Most evangelicals did not believe more traditional candidates of the Christian right, such as Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, or Ben Carson, could protect them, as well as the bombastic, big-talking New York real estate tycoon. As Robert Jeffress, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas and an early Trump supporter, put it, quote, I couldn't care less about a leader's temperament or his tone or his vocabulary. Frankly, I want the meanest, toughest son of a gun I can find. And I think that's the feeling of a lot of evangelicals. They don't want Casper Milquetoast as the leader of the free world, unquote. Ironically, some evangelicals have found a savior. They sought after Trump, he answered them, and he delivered them from all their fears. But again, other evangelical options are available. Evangelicals are people of hope, not fear. The practice of Christian hope points us to a life beyond this world, but it also requires us to act in such a way that models God's coming kingdom. The kingdom of God is characterized by the love of enemies, the welcoming of strangers, the belief in the human dignity of all people, a humble and self-sacrificial posture towards public life, and a trust in the sovereign God of the universe. Fear is a natural response to social change. I would even argue it's a product of the fall of humankind. But evangelicals betray their deepest spiritual convictions when they choose to dwell in fear. The Trump era presents a host of new challenges for evangelicals who believe in the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. The first step in addressing these challenges must come through a reckoning with our past. Evangelicals in the United States have taken many wrong turns over the decades. Even though better, more Christian options, I would argue, could be found by simply opening up the Bible and reading it. We must stop our nostalgic gaze into a Christian golden age in America that probably never existed to begin with, and turn toward the future with renewed hope. It is time, as the great theologian of hope Jürgen Moltmann taught us, to, quote, waken the dead and piece together what has been broken, unquote. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fia. That's the sound of applause that you're not hearing, but it's actually there. We were together. Okay, we will move now to our second presenter, and this is Dr. Brenda Carranza. Dr. Carranza is a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University in Campinas in São Paulo. She holds degrees in theology as well as the social sciences. She studied theology at the University Francisco Marroquín in her native Guatemala. She also studied theology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Campinas and at the Pontifical University of San Anselmo in Rome. She has also taken degrees at the State University of Campinas, where she received her bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in sociology and the social sciences. She completed a postdoctorate in the social sciences at the State University of Rio. Her research has centered on Brazil's varying Catholic movements, including Catholic charismatics and the exportation of Brazilian religions outside of Brazil. At the close of today's session, we'll get the chance to briefly hear about her very interesting new book that she's edited. Let's give Brenda Carranza a very warm welcome. Dr. Carranza.
Muito obrigada, Eric, pela apresentação. Eu quero agradecer, em primeiro lugar, ao professor Alexandre Brasil.
Thank Professor Alexandre Fonseca and all the people and institutions that are part of the organization, especially John Fay, Marion, who are also composing this roundtable discussion. I would also like to thank all the participants, even though I cannot see you all. I know you are in the audience. I would like to also show you this presentation, PowerPoint presentation. I would like to thank Olivia Bandeira, and we started this research and we would like to place our reflection. We are also part of the Laboratory of Anthropology. I also coordinate at UNICAMP, and we are conducting a series of seminars in terms of national and international, discussing the repercussions of the pandemic in religion and the answers that different sides of religions can give in Latin America. The title of my presentation, as you can see, is Evangelicals and Politics in Times of Pandemic, Essentiality of Religious Services in Brazil. So my intervention is part of a legislative fact from which I propose a hypothesis. This is a presentation of the narrative discussion of religious services being considered essential by the Brazilian government. And this is a reflection and an inflection in the political participation of the evangelical corpus in Brazil. And here I take back the idea that was exposed by Paul Freston this morning, which is the diversity of the evangelical body that we discuss. But I will focus on, within this diversity, I'm going to focus on the elite, the parliamentary elite, pastoral elites, and media elites of the evangelical body, which is what we are discussing here. To this end, I would like to show you this PowerPoint presentation that I'm trying to go to the next slide. I was afraid that this would happen. I need to go to the next slide. Here it is. I think you can see it. So for this argument that I'm proposing, I'm going to start by a legislative fact. On the 20th of March, the Brazilian federal government enacted Decree 10,282/2020 that defined more than 20 essential activities that could not be postponed by the community, considered indispensable or essential to the community. So they considered activities that would pose a threat to the population. And 5 days later, we would have the inclusion of religious activities of any nature as part of these essential services. And so it was demanded, so this is a controversial topic, that they should flexibilize the opening of the temples, of the churches, and this will create a public controversy in Brazil, showing the difference within the government, state and municipal government in certain that wanted a judicial interference on behalf on the part of the judicial forces in the country. So they recognize the activity of. So there was a pressure, parliamentary pressure. On the 18th of March, the Parliamentary Front in the National Congress emitted a note asking for the reopening of temples. And this was also supported by evangelical leadership that have great visibility. And even though some of them had attitudes of, in the beginning, to ignore the pandemic, they had contradictory discourses about how to go about conducting the crisis. But the arguments that are placed in the defense that included as the religious service as essential would be spiritual, social, and political realms. And so the political realm, we're not going to discuss so much, but spiritually, what they would see it as the need to put the churches and temples to the service of the community and the society, because these are places where you have the opportunity to have spiritual service and comfort, and through prayers and rituals that could calm down the anxieties produced by the pandemic. So we would also see that the crisis could be overcome if the religious realm is included, and also psycho-emotional help, and they see religious activities as an emotional refuge, both as a media, through the media, and also presentially, face-to-face. And the third dimension would be that social issue because we have a nation in crisis that need agents, religious institutions that legitimate the authorities that conduct the pandemic, regardless of the moral judgments of this governance. And this last part, which would be this social convention and the political repercussions and this argument of essentiality of religious service, is my proposal to discuss here with you. So we're going to talk about it's a hypothesis, three types of repercussions. First, we consider that essentiality, the narrative, the discourse of essentiality is of religious service is a new point the pandemic brings. It's a novelty in terms of discussing and defending evangelical participation in the public sphere, coming together with the classic arguments of freedom of speech, religious freedom, and secularity. Also, religious legitimacy could be construed according to the stance of the Bolsonaro administration before the pandemic. The authority of the president to govern Brazil as a Christian nation so that we can believe better days are coming after the pandemic times. The third repercussion that composes this narrative is the construction of a project or the consolidation and the support, a performatic support of a political project that seeks a cultural hegemony led by the evangelical sector and reaches the conservative areas and fields of society, including the Christian right and the evangelical right wings. And so we have these components. So an argument of legitimacy that is construed, the argument of an authority that is constituted, and also the reinforcement of a political project of a cultural hegemony. So I would like to say that we are working with a multi-situated, multi-situ research of a ethnography, and it's also can also be called an ethnographic multi-situ type of research according to George Marcus, and according to data that we had from March to July, that also includes Latin America, that won't be able to also share here because we come from the hypothesis that Brazil was and is a point outside the curve. And so we work with three types of sources. We have news, and we consolidated the big tools of international and national media in different countries. In Brazil, with the greatest audience, digital platforms, and the monitoring of programs in the broadcast television that is open to the whole country. Well, the construction of all of this narrative, argumentation, and performance, we have three events. One that is the National Day of Fasting, which is also a celebration of Easter, another conference in Brazil, and a prayer in favor of the authorities, officials in Brazil on 5th of June. And for this discussion, I would like to present these three elements that we consider performatic in the sense that propose public events according to Marisa Periano and Stanley Tambia. They propose to observe public events from the point of view of ritualization. Thus, these events not only present alliances and social positions, but they also dispute and contribute to produce new alliances and positions. Even in this scenario of pandemic, some events that have been assigned by institutions, evangelical institutions, and they contributed to the construction of an ongoing evangelical project. They also carried out online meetings that were shared in different platforms such as Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And the organizers, including the president. And they had also public repercussions in these events. At the same time, such events gained highlight in the media and the press. And they reinforced the argument of Bolsonaro, the president, that his supporters, the press, be would have biased interests. And so I will focus my attention on the National Day of Fasting on 5th of April. So the first religious event, which was the National Day of Fasting, it was greatly performatic. It was in the beginning of April, a video that was launched in the social media summoning the army of Christ. And besides Bolsonaro, other leadership and greater part of the Pentecostal pastors and neo-Pentecostal as well, charismatic churches emphasized the holy proclamation made by the supreme chief of the country, referring to President Bolsonaro. So this National Day of Fasting would be for the nation and for the people. The pandemic of the new coronavirus was seen as a world concern, but also as a spiritual battle, according to the speech of some of the participants. And the evil we need to combat with fasting and prayer and crying out to God. Also, another performatic event besides this one, the National Day of Prayer Fasting, which was on Palm Sunday, April 5th, was the Easter video conference for 2 hours that was also summoned by the president and the First Lady, Michelle Bolsonaro. The event counted on the participation of 21 Christian leaderships, 17 evangelicals, greatest part pastors, but also singers and Catholics. One bishop, one priest singer, and a lay singer. They had a entrepreneur presenter, and the Brazilian was in charge of SBT, which is a broadcast Brazilian television supporting Bolsonaro, and is part of the media that positively covers the current Bolsonaro administration. And also as a performance, we have Brazil seen as a Christian nation and not anymore as a Catholic nation, which was already consolidated in the history of the country. The religious strengthening of the country as presenters of a religious field that is heterogeneous, as we saw earlier this morning. We should highlight the way that religious leadership wants to pray, crying out to God, asking for his protection, to prophesy over the nation, addressing their words, songs, and gestures that you could see on TV, placing their hands over the cameras, and their gestures and all of these images show a prophetic mission to be carried out by religious authorities and by the idea that they are incarnating in the President Bolsonaro all of these ideas. And he also has in his name the name Messiah is his middle name, Messias. So they have three arguments. First, spiritual ideology of pandemic as a work of God in reaction to the growth of the number of evangelicals. So this is a positive mission of evangelical intervention in the pandemic times. And this would serve the purposes of God and carry on this Christian nation. Secondly, the importance of religion's actions such as prayer to fight against the pandemic, among other enemies that come upon the nation. And lastly, to soothe and offer faith and hope, saying that Brazil will be a country at the end of the pandemic that will come out of it stronger and positively, economically, socially, and religiously. During these 2 hours of video conference, only 2 leaderships mentioned social distancing and other actions concerning public health in terms of controlling the pandemic, emphasizing only the spiritual dimension of this process. The prayers talked about the authority and Brazilian family, seeing a family in the traditional model, heteronormative, media class, white people, and so on. And there were very few prayers on solidarity to the victims of COVID-19 and those who are at the forefront of healthcare. Also, according to the religious authorities, they have a trust placed in the government to fight against the pandemic. Overall is the idea that the president would have been chosen, authorized by God to command Brazil, to govern Brazil. So in this narrative that is quite dramatic, that has been carried out by a few pastors and repeated by Bolsonaro during the video conference, the president would have survived by a miracle to the knife that was thrust on his stomach in the beginning of his presidential campaign. To the Catholic singer, this divine intervention would be because Brazil is a country that is declared as the Lord's, and it was born to win. And they refer to public declarations of the president that his governance, his administration would be strengthened by God to win over all evils, including the pandemic. So in this campaign, they had allies in religious organizations and said that Brazil, above all, before God, and above all and everyone. So Brazil would be protected according to this narrative. But it seems that there was a doubt among the participants that there was no doubt that Brazil would come out of it stronger, strengthened, and with greater fraternity for a greater future, with better days after the storm. A new time would come, a time of prosperity that had never happened before in our history. If the pandemic is new in the history of Brazil, it would also be new the long peace that awaits Brazil after the sanitation crisis. So Brazil would be considered the greatest nation in the world, economically speaking. They will send us missionaries from all over the world to declare that Jesus is alive. Jesus is alive, and he is the Lord of the Brazilian nation. The pastor that is also a federal deputy affirmed that the success was already visible. He said, and I quote, "Last week, Brazil, the whole country stopped for a time of fasting, of prayer, and all of this sealed Brazil." In these last 25 years, we saw radical changes happening, and other changes happened, and I couldn't not mention before the press, the media, and other people who were against hydroxychloroquine are now bowing and starting to feel the effects of the medication. That will show great results. However, the facts do not coincide with the declaration of the pastoral leadership and parliamentary leaders, because at the time of the conference, the number of dead and infected in Brazil more than doubled, going from 487,000 to 1,230, and over 22,000 infected. Also, the president's allies had a controversy views about hydroxychloroquine, which, as we affirmed before, would follow the example of Donald Trump. They against recommendations by the World Health Organization, and also this contributed to the informative disorder and complete mess that comes upon the country. Also, on spiritual support to Bolsonaro, they will continue to be performed and performatic, especially by social media. On 5th of June rather, we would have an event, prayer in favor of Brazil, with the presence of Bolsonaro and evangelical leaders. They gathered together pastors in the Planalto Palace, and the leadership defined the event as a religious event that was prophetic, a prophetic religious event. And the goal was to pray for the president, for the Congress, National Congress, for the Supreme Court, and as a representative, a maximum representative of justice for the Brazilian people and Brazilian government. With more than 35,000 dead and more than 600,000 infected, these evangelical leaderships and the president did not wear masks or protected themselves. And minimizing the pandemic, ritualizing the President Bolsonaro as chosen by God to guide the nation, and the narrative construction of Brazil as a Christian nation, that better days would come in the history after the pandemic. And it's interesting to highlight that these religious events would be carried out in the middle of a culture of governance, a crisis of governance in the Supreme Court, without any protocols on behalf of President Bolsonaro and his Vice President Mourão. They also registered more than 30 requests for impeachment for the president before the Congress, and also a public investigation of dissemination of fake news and attacks to the Minister of the National Supreme Court, besides also anti-democratic acts. At the same time, it is seen as urgent the judgment of matters such as abortion and gender ideology. So it's very interesting that in the middle of all the sanitary crisis, this would be dear themes for the evangelical agenda, and they are placed as urgent matters, their discussions in the agenda. So with all of this, I come to the closing remarks of these three performing acts that compose a narrative that help us understand a little bit of what is happening in the pandemic in what refers to this reinforcement of a political presence in this evangelical scenario in Brazil. So it shows that the essentiality of religious services is a new argumentation, and it is quite different from old arguments such as the defense and the fight for religious freedom, and the questions we saw as secularity, laicity, which reinforces the political participation of the evangelical sector in Brazil that will, in a way, place before society, because they are arguing that religion is an essential service, before society, before the government, which these sectors that are from the parliament, from churches, and also from the evangelical elite through the media would be in a certain way reinforcing this argument before the government, before society, and clearly before their voters. So this would allow a legitimacy before this performance and political participation in this moment of crisis. We also see that the register of the pandemic, they have a double-faced ideology. In the pandemic would have a positive point, a theological positive point, because it allows for the evangelical sector and the Christian sector to advance in their agendas, and that they would be consolidated and favor the political participation of the evangelicals, but also the participation of the essentiality of religion that in a way will show the reinforcement that is positive because it advances the Christian nation. And if there is a negative element, they would be hindrances placed by spiritual warfare that Brazil is trying to get rid of, those political and social economic sectors that would oppose Brazil being a Christian nation directed and governed by authorities legitimized and chosen by God. And this narrative of essentiality of religion reinforces Brazil as a chosen nation by God, as a nation chosen by God that responds to its calling, both authorities and officials, and also the evangelical people answering this call. And all of these performances showing the spiritual power that these prophetic voices have, the power conferred to the President of the Republic for being chosen, that shows, and it is shown in very clearly in the prayers that are placed in all of these lives. And I would like to highlight Josué Balandro Jr.'s prayer from the Baptist Church Attitude that is also that Michelle Bolsonaro, First Lady, attends. He says, and I quote, "I praise God for a president that allows us in this conference to gather together evangelical and Catholic leaderships, Christians from all segments, to declare over our nation that Jesus Christ is alive. And this is why COVID will not win, will not conquer. Coronavirus will not win over us, and no threat will win." So we would also have, with the pandemic, an opportunity to reinforce a political and religious project that has been designed and that has already been mentioned this morning by Paul Freston, and in a way, in some interventions from the different videos that have been placed here, and also in the talks that were presented of this international seminar and webinar that make reference to social demonstrations of 2013, and then the impeachment of the President Rousseff in 2016, and the elections of 2018 that will consolidate in a certain way and will design how exactly the evangelical sector that will start being consolidated in these three events aligned to the right wing and conservative sectors will constitute themselves as a political actor. And this is not a new factor. We all know about this. We know this is a construction that has more than 3 decades, and we see all of these possibilities of articulations, alliances, performances in the religious realm, and partisan alliances that would come to consolidate with the evangelical sector as a political actor that at this point will show their own agenda, and also being consolidated with the presidential elections of Bolsonaro as a president. If they are not determining for the election of Bolsonaro, definitely if this were not true, we wouldn't have seen so many evangelical voters voting for Bolsonaro. And also alliances with the political conservative sectors and the right wing and the Christian right are also very clear, and they start being constituted. And the Christian right has been already presented by John Fia, and he placed it really well around fear. And the Christian response is a religious response of fear from the right wing. Seeing the advances that he placed really well, feminism and sexual freedom and the defense of patriarchy, patriarchal family, and of course, the promotion and organization of pro-life programs. We know that these alliances and the Brazilian right are not new. They are historically present in the Constitution and currently in the support to the neoliberal politics, the military agendas, and public safety agendas that also brings a strong component of anti-plurality, anti-communism, anti-feminist rhetoric. And we also have the alliances that are, in a certain way, a cut in the conservatism, neoconservatism, the proposal of being against the advances of the platforms, the agendas, the advancements, the democratic advances that promote profound change from the point of view of a fundamental equality of rights. And also another component, especially in the Christian right, which is the building of a Christian nation that not necessarily implies in the majority, but also a strong political force to promote a morality and a social Christian worldview supported by ultra-right Catholic wing, and also in other regions that will have these ideological and political alliances that get together. A nation commanded by evangelicals to substitute the Catholic majority that could not make of Brazil a Christian nation. We have, in the pandemic, also coming from 2016, a few inflections that allow us to see how this continues. The election of the pastor Marcelo Crivella, who is a bishop of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, the nomination of Damaris Alves, who is an evangelical woman from the Baptist Church of Lagoinha, and she is in charge of the human rights, family, and women, and seeing women and during the pandemic, the nomination of a minister, terribly evangelic minister, of the strength of a identity marker that would place evangelical as capable of this construction of this political religious project of a Christian nation through the minister that was nominated, André Mendonça, from the Presbyterian Church that commands the ministry of justice that is replacing Sergio Moro, and also the nomination, the education minister of the Presbyterian pastor Milton Ribeiro, that substitutes also Abraham Weintraub, and also we have in charge of one of the greatest bodies of scientific development in Brazil, CAPES, another evangelical, Benedito Guimarães de Aguiar Neto, defender of creationism. So we can see the legislative, all the three powers, legislative, judicial, executive, and they are relentless, even during the times of the pandemic. And I would like to show that they are seeking a cultural hegemony that has been clearly construed and built with the agenda of morality, coming up against LGBTQ communities and feminism, a cultural hegemony agenda that shows itself performatically through public events, maybe through marches, spectacles, lives that reinforce this hegemony of a Christian nation commanded by a morality that should be placed by the majority and imposed to all. And this religious and political power, this project of religious and political power of cultural hegemony in the times of the pandemic are relentless. And I can see, this is what I can see up to now. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I went over time, but thank you so much.
All right, we have now the privilege of hearing a response to these two fine papers from Dr. Marion Brepohl. She is a professor at the Federal University of Paraná in Curitiba in Brazil, a research fellow of the National Council of Scientific and Technological Development. She received her doctorate in history from the State University of Campinas and did postdoctoral work at the University of Paris, Sorbonne, and the Free University of Berlin. She specializes in political history with a focus on political behavior, religion and politics, dictatorship, Nazism, imperialism, and racism. Among other things, she is the editor of a marvelous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, 50 Years Later, published in 2013. She was a member of the original 2013 team that we've been talking about from the Nagel Institute trip, and it's my deep pleasure to welcome Marion. Let's listen carefully. Marion.
Obrigada. Para mim é uma satisfação estar aqui hoje quando a Daniela.
To be here when Daniela was moved in the morning. I was also moved because I was also emotional, but I was not speaking at the time. But to see all of you gathering, I think that it was Daniela that remembered that it was, you know, that time of Barack Obama, Dilma Rousseff. And so we were all building hope. And we had this hope in Evangelicals in Brazil. I remember that we visited some very interesting projects, and right now everything seems to be somewhat destroyed. And it's as if we are visiting a just a horrible, horrible place. And we know that everything was being planned, you know, during this time. But obviously, I will not actually respond to the papers that were presented before. They raised many different issues, especially John Fia. He talked about 3 centuries of the history of the United States, but I would like to mention some specific points that will allow me to make specific connections among the conversations so that we can reflect on the history, the politics, and also the theology, if that is possible, if I'm not being delusional on my contributions tonight. But I would just like to help in these 3 aspects. So regarding John's talk, I was able to read his paper beforehand, and so it was easier for me, or actually less hard, to make my comments now due to the fact that I read his paper. He talked about this, you talked about this, right, John? You said that we have this feel, and because when we talk about social history and social movements, it's a lot better to talk about feelings than just the history of ideas or the history of a thought, of a way of thinking, because we know that social movements are guided by feelings and not necessarily by ideas. Even when we talk about ideologies, they are actually feelings regarding our ideologies that move us as people. And of course, you are allowing us to go back to the 17th century and make this connection to Trump. I'm not an expert in United States history, but some of the facts that you mentioned are very well known, even for those of us that are not historians. So I would like to start by what I remember as a young woman, even though I'm a Presbyterian, and I have been since I was a teenager, and going to Presbyterian church. What I remember of this time when I was a young woman was how we would make fun and really mock the evangelicals, the missionaries that would come from the United States to Brazil. And they would come in this imperialistic way, always as foreigners. And we always saw them in a hostile manner. Perhaps we were also hiding our own fears at the time, right? And it was during the military dictatorship here in Brazil. And so when I teach now about the Brazilian dictatorship, I see that the images that we have of those who resisted the military dictatorship are images that have a lot more signs saying, you know, we don't want you imperialism, we don't want you United States, but nobody was fighting capitalism, for instance. So this American church was always seen serving the domestication of Brazilians. So we would make fun of the clothes that the missionaries would wear. We made fun of their Brazilian accent when they were, their American accent when they were speaking Portuguese. And we also made fun of those who converted to their message, because we would look at them as people that were just insecure and would just obey anyone that would tell them what to do. So there was this fear on their side, but there was also this fear that was disguised here through this mocking and these jokes that were made. And we realized that this fear was present, and you talk about these fears as being almost paranoid, you know, because they even feared the Catholics, as you said, but they were sending missionaries since 1840, and they were sending missionaries all over the world, all over the planet, really. And they even sent missionaries to Brazil, and they were even being unsuccessful. If we would compare the beginning of the 20th century and the coming of three missionaries that were coming from the United States, but they were Swedish, and they were the ones that founded the Assembly of God Church. If we compare them to American missionaries that came in the 1840s, they were even more successful than these American ones. And the Brazilian missionaries certainly went to study overseas, and so the Latin Americans were also more successful than the Americans. But this doesn't matter. But what does matter is that on the one hand, you had this hostile opinion of a foreigner. They could be Catholics, they could be Jewish, they could be whatever they were, and they were migrating to the United States. And on the other hand, you had this strong positioning going and being sent from your country. So this threat that leads to fear and hostility is actually accompanied by a desire to be in this supreme figure, or at least to prevail and to be the leader among all. So there are these two sides that are present there as feeling. However, this entropy and this desire to protect your own territory against the invasions of other people, and Afro-Americans as well, or people of color that we don't really know. Are they Muslim? Are they Black? You know, are they bringing these superstitions to our country? Their religious practices that we always name just superstition, whoever they are. And so this entropy should not allow us to think that this group was or is united, because in the United States, just like in Brazil, we do have a lot of denominations. So there are very present internal conflicts within these evangelical groups in these churches. So to other people, to those who are outside, we present this unity speech and this evangelical, united, Bible-believing, evangelizing people, white people. But internally, by what we can see, when we look at the number of denominations, we realize there's actually a lot of dispute and even power disputes there. And so my question to you, John, is these two sides that you're presenting, you know, one that would be a connection to conservative movements, and on the other hand, a more progressive group. Shouldn't we be able to talk about dissent and even ruptures in processes of even leaving the faith, especially due to this movement that goes from conservative to progressive, and even a reactionary movement part, you know, maybe the deep of the United States would include very conservative regions, as sometimes we see in movies, but also a New York that is very secularized and that doesn't care for religion at all. And I remember the film Moses, where it's not Moses, sorry, Samson and Delilah. And Samson's mom tells him, "Are you marrying Delilah? She is someone who's not from our region. She's not from our people." And Delilah is this charming woman. And so this shows this mother from the countryside facing a modern woman, because Delilah presented all of this American secularized perspective, you know, and she is nothing like what the Hebrew women would be like. And so you see this conflict between the small town and the big city of the United States that would be more cosmopolitan, secularized, and modern per se. Another important aspect that I also considered as I heard you speak is, after so much time and having such a heavy past with the Ku Klux Klan, slavery, racism, Luther King's murder, and everything that happened, what are evangelicals doing with their own past? How are they considering racism, slavery, imperialism, going back to what we heard from Paul Freston this morning? Are they trying to somehow reckon with their past in terms of identity, culture, faith, and values? I believe we do not have, you know, in the United States, a theocratic government, but we do have a strong presence of norms that are based on religious convictions. So a religious confession tends to self-reflect and to have this inward look. So after these 3 centuries of experience, we still see this layer between faith and values. There's nostalgia, and they still want a white society, a society that will have these characteristics. And it's funny because in this, we see this relationship with Brazil. It's a mass democracy where you have this type of political advertising, and the political advertising in the United States, there are all these bumper stickers and bans and all the conviction of the political parties. I remember that when I was in my postdoctorate in France, they always talked about the United States. That it always felt the town halls and the conventions always felt like a 7-year-old birthday party. And they always, they are similar to some of our church parties, you know, the same way that we celebrate things. And it also can be similar to a Christmas service. There are all these childish events, and we see this in Brazil as well. I would say that it's this mass advertisement that would really remind me of Billy Graham. And Billy Graham was someone that once said, and it was at the Lausanne conference, he said that, and he never repeated that. Probably someone rebuked him for it, but he said in Lausanne that he acknowledged that the North American missionary activity did not respect the Latin American culture. But he would always say during the dictatorship that Brazil was like an island of tranquility. So I see and I understand all the movements that you mentioned, but I see these issues that I said. It's a pendular movement between a theology that would be very naive and evangelistic in nature, and a ideology that would be protecting itself on the one hand and be self-victimizing as well, thinking there's a threat against me, but at the same time, they intend to prevail. They intend to win and be the supremacists, not for the whole world, but at least in most regions of the planet. So once again, this is the impression I get. The United States is not under a theocracy, But this issue of a norm that is given by a Christian doctrine is very present. And in fact, secularization is not as present as we would think. And to you, Brenda, this is what I would like to say. So, Brenda, I could go very far because, of course, your study is a lot closer to what I know. We are experiencing this moment in history, but I will try to be brief to give more time for other people to ask questions. I agree with almost everything you said about Brazil, and one of the things that I always think about, because it calls my attention in terms of countries that want to be supremacist, because they start to say that they will be a great nation and they will send missionaries. That sounds like the United States, because the United States was a great nation and they sent a lot of missionaries, so we are going to be that as well. So my question is Bolsonaro betting on this? Does he consider that facing a disorganized civil society, his only chance of having the support of the poorer community would be the evangelicals? So that's why he would give so much importance, at least in the media aspect, to the evangelicals. And so considering this, I would like to know what you think about those who want to reflect and think about the criminalization of abortion, the left, and the homosexuals. And I think that Damaris Alves, for instance, the minister that you mentioned, even though she seems like a caricature, she is the second most popular minister of Brazil, which I think is just absurd. But it's that, but it's not only that, as you said in the end of your talk. We have neo-Calvinists in power. It's not only on the popular base, it's not only the lives that you mentioned, but he's always taking part in evangelical events. But he put different evangelicals that are that name themselves or that are called neo-Calvinists, and they're also theonomic. I think that they would even be theocratic, really. And there's some aspects that you mentioned. You know, they are self-made men, they are anti-intellectual, anti-feminists, heteronormative, they defend the patriarchal family. And an important element in this group that I would like to talk about, because this is my field and I am very much interested in emphasizing this issue, is that from one part to the other, in the secular realm and also in the religious realm, these people are denying the dictatorship that happened in Brazil. They relativize torture. And in the case of Sergio Moro, who unfortunately was even my colleague at the university, they support violence and criminalization of poor people. So if you look at the anti-crime package bill of bills that was defended by Sergio Moro, the worst measures, for example, homicide against minors who commit crimes was not approved. But still, this violence element, and I said that as a joke once, as a sarcastic joke, that Guedes, our economic minister, was killing the old people because of the pension reform, but Moro was killing the young men because of the anti-crime bill. And the Bolsonaro government was denying all of this, and Damaris has a fundamental role denying all the torture processes, because it was in her ministry that all of the processes and all the lawsuits that are related to the crimes that were committed by the government during the military dictatorship, all of them were suspended. All the investigations were halted. And this was also done with the support of these evangelical leaders. So Minister Damaris just says that she won't do that. And she denied Dilma Rousseff her rights. But the only the only claim that Dilma Rousseff had was for the time that she was in prison to be considered before. But she said that you can't have that, because Dilma Rousseff was a president from the Workers' Party. She can't get anything. And so all of the other requests were suspended. And so all of this denial regarding the military dictatorship and everything else, and all the attacks against indigenous peoples, deforestation is also attacking indigenous populations, and the fact that the evangelicals are supporting all these measures. So I was trying to get everything together for us to consider all the doctrines that are actually guiding all of these evangelical peoples. So I hope that I was able to keep my time there, Eric.
Okay.
Thank you, Marion.
Marion. We have about 15 minutes. Opa. Okay, sorry. So we have about 15 minutes for questions and answers. John and Brenda, you would have heard in there some responses from Marion that you can choose to take up. But I'm also going to give you a couple of the questions coming in on the chat, and you can try to kind of respond to these as you wish. There's a question that we're getting about the relationship between Brazil and the military. Anaxuel, I believe it is commenting that in Brazil, evangelicals have had a fascination with the military to the point of it being, they're willing to turn against democracy for the sake of military rule if it supports the causes they're interested in. He's wondering if you see any similar fascination between American evangelicals and the military as a means to get power, to sustain power. So do you see a relationship between, do you see American evangelicals having an unusual affinity for the military? And do you see it as part of their program?
Yeah, I think it's a central part of it, and it always has been. You know, by training, I am an early American historian. I studied the 18th century by training. You even see this going back to evangelical ministers who are supporting, you know, the American Revolution, the rebellion, the war, you know, to advance this kind of Christian idea that somehow God is on the side of liberty and freedom and resistance to Great Britain. But in the more contemporary, you know, 20th century, I think you see this kind of militarism all over the place. The Cold War, obviously. You know, Billy Graham in his early years preached probably more about, or just as much, right, about those godless communists, right? It was one word back then, right? You know, the godless communists, and the desire to build up military power to prevent this kind of, you know, force of evil. And I think, you know, it's evangelicals love the fact that Donald Trump is at least claiming to build up the military again in the way that it was during the Reagan era, which in many ways was the last big high point of, you know, the emergence of this kind of Christian right kind of stuff. This is also a question you should probably pose tomorrow to Kristen Kobes-Dumay. I don't know if she's listening into this or not, but this militarism is often, she makes a pretty compelling case in her recent book, that this militarism is also tied into this kind of masculine, you know, kind of idea of white evangelical Christianity in America. So yeah, I see definite, you know, I don't know, I'm not a scholar of Brazil or Brazilian evangelicalism, but, you know, evangelical Trumpism is nothing, you know, in relation to the military. I see nothing but continuity, as opposed to, you know, this suddenly emerged. You see this in the war, in American Revolution, War of 1812, you know, why we need to, you know, why the South needs to fight the North and the North needs to use arms to fight the South in the Civil War, right? They're both articulating it. So yeah, it's all over American history. It's closely linked.
All right, thank you. Some questions here about the extent to which and this can be open to Marion, Brenda, or John, the extent to which this is really a sort of anti-democratic form of movement among evangelicals in Brazil or the United States, or the extent to which it's just a deep frustration with corruption, with all kinds of political sort of disasters that people are very deeply dissatisfied with. And so they're just striking out for another option. It's not that they dislike democracy, they just think the current situation isn't working. Anybody have a response to that? Are we seeing anti-democratic evangelicals in Brazil and the United States? Are evangelicals acting in an anti-democratic way, or is the state of the liberal union, as it were, the liberal democracy, still strong?
I'll let Brenda speak to that for Brazil first. Sorry to put you on the spot. I mean, I'm happy to give you the answer too.
Go ahead, John. Let's see if Marion,
you know, or if Marion wants to add. I think if you listen to evangelical supporters for Donald Trump, and just a real quick response to Marion's point, she's exactly right about the diversity of the of American evangelicalism. You know, if I had to go back and think about the way I framed my argument about Trump and evangelicals, I would probably be a little more nuanced in the way I described the 81%. You know, so the 81% of white evangelicals is a huge number. And in some ways, they're all complicit in what Trump has wrought, right, so to speak. But within that 81%, there are people who kind of, you know, either hated Hillary Clinton or held their nose and voted for Trump. And then there are the kind of, you know, there are the kind of strong Trump supporters, the people who go to Trump rallies, the people who wear Make America Great Again hats, you know, and so forth. Again, I think all of them are in one way or another complicit in what Trump has brought, but they do it for different reasons. Now, if you talk to any of these 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Trump, they would never question the idea of American democracy. You know, again, trying to understand them kind of as a historian, right? They would never question the idea that democracy is under threat. In fact, it is the left, it is the secular, you know, the secular left that is really threatening democracy, because they understand democracy, you know. Suddenly, since Obama, they have begun to understand democracy now much more in terms of pluralism than they had in the past. In the past, it was we must become a Christian nation, right? We must take over, right? We must pass an amendment to the Constitution saying marriage is between a man and a woman. We must reclaim America. You still see a little bit of that language, but it's not as strong anymore. Now they've become victims, and now they're beginning to kind of talk about, you know, well, we don't want our churches to be closed down, or we don't want I was just talking to an evangelical, just a layperson yesterday, who told me that, they're worried about Joe Biden, because he's going to shut down the churches and take away their religious liberty. I mean, well, Thomas Jefferson, the critics of Thomas Jefferson said that in 1800. So I think they're beginning to now articulate they've lost so many battles, right? So no longer it is we want to make gay marriage illegal. We know we can't win anymore. So now we want to talk about a democratic kind of pluralism in which people who believe in marriage between a man and a woman can practice their faith without being persecuted. You see the slight change in strategy there. And it's because of so many losses that have taken place. So I would think they're just two competing visions of the liberal order and liberal democracy. And then you have the extremes on both sides. I might get in trouble for this in some sectors of American academia, and I have, but I think you see an extreme on the sort of left, right? After the George Floyd killing, as well as extremes on the right, and in many ways they mirror each other, right? These two extremes who are both attacking the liberal order. They're both attacking democracy. They're both wanting to burn it down and start all over again, but in different ways. And I tend to find myself more in the kind of camp of those who signed the letter to Harper's Weekly a couple months ago, the kind of Sean Wilentz camp, or the Harper's camp, or so forth, that sort of wants to preserve a kind of robust democratic pluralism.
Okay. Thank you, John. Marion.
So long on
No. Marion and Brenda, any comments on the state of democratic belief among evangelicals in Brazil? Do you perceive Brazilian evangelicals as democratic in spirit? Okay.
Eu posso falar, ou Brenda?
No.
No, por favor, Marion, depois eu posso falar.
Tá bem, eu penso que
After that, I can speak. Well, I think it's very different from the United States, because the United States will fight in parliament so that there won't be gay marriage, so that abortion is not legalized. And if it's legalized, they are going to fight against when it can be done, etc. But we see that the civil society is very mobilized, and we heard Joel in the opening session talking about this. Fortunately, they have this position. What is this government after? We're going to be suspicious about it, and we are going to oppose it. We will protest. And so those who are watching the government are actually society. But in Brazil, we don't see that position. We question why certain evangelicals, because we do have diversity in the evangelical world, but what we see in Brazil is that the progressive evangelicals are not visible at all, because those who control the media are Edir Macedo, Silas Malafaia, neo-Pentecostal and Pentecostal pastors. So this morning, somebody sent on the chat, Marion, aren't you aware that we have progressive evangelicals? Yes, we're here, but we're very non-visible to this country. So why is this support to the dictatorship, why was this done by evangelicals? Well, because of the two-devil theory, right? Those who were for the military dictatorship were actually against guerrillas and against terrorism and against this and against that. So that's why there was the dictatorship, but that's not true. And since we didn't have a transition like Chile, like Uruguay, and like Argentina had, this narrative of the far right is still present. How many indigenous people were killed at the time of a dictatorship? They were not guerrilla members. They were not politicians. They weren't anything. And there was this man who was just military man. I have 40 examples like this, but I will just mention one. There was this man who was from the Air Force, and he trained his team to save for rescue and search and rescue. And he was recruited by the army to throw subversive people in the ocean. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. They're going to die. And this guy was arrested and tortured just because he denied doing that, and he lost his job. And so it's this type of person that is, you know, in the 90% of those who were denied their forced retirement and resignation, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what I say, that there was no transition. I'm not saying that those who were part of the armed struggle against the military forces should not be arrested. I know that they should be arrested. They have to be arrested. Those who commit crimes have to be arrested, but no torture, of course. So we did have a transition regime. So this denial of the dictatorship is welcomed by Bolsonaro and his supporters, so that we can create this theory of the two demons. So evangelicals, they look at the dictatorship time as a time in which they were able to receive radio and television concessions from the government. It was during this time, different pastors of the Baptist Church came during that time, and they made many different honoring moments to General Medsi, who was one of the leaders of the dictatorship.
Brenda. Ah, que pena, desculpa,
Brenda.
falei demais.
No. We need to come back in 2 hours, and our interpreters need to rest. So thank you to the interpreters. But one thing I will say in closing, and that is that it's clear to me that we have a crisis in liberal democracy of sorts that surfaced again, and that Christians, we all need to give ourselves to public theology, to developing a public theology, so that we can think clearly and coherently across our differences about how we should approach the public sphere in this moment. And that's exactly what this webinar exists to do. And there's much more of this later. So stay tuned, go get some dinner, take a rest, go take a swim, and we'll be back in 2 hours. Thank you again to John Fia, to Brenda Carranza, and to Marion Brepohl for their wonderful participation today with us. Take care, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.